So, as most people who have been exposed to this teaching will have recognized, is that what is presented is a conceptual framework. And then within that conceptual framework, there are a lot of subcomponents that hopefully, once that framework is seen and understood, once the framework becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, it can start to be an aid in order for us to see life as is described in the conceptual framework. Because of the way that our brains have developed and relate to information, we can very easily receive the information and think that receiving the information is what it's all about. That tends to be how the intellect or how the brain values information sometimes, just almost like an asset. But information that isn't applied isn't much of an asset, really. So the encouragement here is that the framework, which are a set of descriptions, a set of pointers that are pointing at your own present moment experience, or pointing at dynamics within your own present moment experience. The encouragement is for the conceptual framework, the intellectual understanding, to be applied to your own life experience. And that allows the understanding to drop much deeper. It means that the understanding will go from an intellectual understanding to a deepening understanding, and hopefully a total understanding. And a total understanding is characterized as the dissolution of the misunderstanding that exists in our system. So the total understanding isn't having volumes of knowledge. Total understanding is when the pointers, the concepts, which start off as intellectual understanding, get into the system and uproot the volumes of misunderstanding that life has put in place. And once the misunderstanding is dissolved, then the conceptual framework, the information that is really just there to allow us to see life a particular way, then that too can fall away. And once that falls away, we still continue to see life the way that has been pointed out, but not through a lens of concept, but just because we see it as it is, because the misunderstanding that prevented us from seeing it as it is has dissolved. Right? So what does this mean? So let's look at what it means that the teaching is a conceptual framework, a set of pointers, a set of descriptions. So when you hear the teaching, try and hear it as it's just been described, a set of descriptions, a set of pointers that are directing your attention onto certain dynamics that haven't been seen before. So an example of a subset of the overall conceptual framework is this. Happiness for the human being is not happiness in the form of pleasure, 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 but rather happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind. That's a concept, it's a description. Something has just been described. Happiness for the human being has just been described. Happiness for the human being is not happiness through pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Not happiness to be found in circumstance being a certain way. That happiness isn't available in this life on a continuous, unbroken basis. the happiness that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis, the happiness that the human being is really yearning for, is a happiness that is available in the form of continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And so that's a conceptual description that's just being put forward. It's being put forward in conversational language. If we listen to it, there's a whole lot of descriptions. In brief, happiness for the human being is peace of mind. Concept. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering. Concept. Suffering arises in practical forms as guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. Concept. And then the conceptual framework goes on to describe what guilt is, to describe what blame is, to describe what pride is, to describe anxiety and worry, to describe expectation and attachment to outcomes. The framework includes a description of what a biological reaction is and what a psychological reaction is. Descriptions of what we can call the working mind and the thinking mind. It talks about genes and up-to-date conditioning. All of these are concepts that make up the overall conceptual framework. And the overall conceptual framework is really addressing one topic only. And the topic is not how to become a better human being, a better person that functions more perfectly. It's not about becoming more saintly. The topic is about happiness in daily living for the human being. So if someone is interested in that topic, then everything that is spoken about in these talks is spoken about only because it's relevant to that one topic. So really what we're talking about is happiness in daily living for the human being from a practical perspective. Enlightenment has been described by Buddha when it's condensed down into the simplest of forms as suffering is the end of suffering. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. How much simpler an explanation can we be given? And it was explained that the description was in its negative form, in its negation form, for very good reason. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. Because accurately, when we look at what is delivered after this process, what is delivered as a result of, let's say, enlightenment, let's call it enlightenment, we find that nothing has been added. We haven't gained something that we didn't have before. But rather, the process has removed certain attributes, beliefs, basically, you could say, of the human being that were the basis on which suffering arose. So in practical terms, what's delivered is a change that no longer allows suffering to arise. Now, let's be clear, suffering isn't referring to physical pain. Because in the English language, and I'm sure in other languages, we often will use the word suffering. Like, I had to suffer through the pain of a toothache. So it implies that suffering has to do with circumstantial pain. But really, suffering as it's related, as it's referred to in these talks and in spirituality is, in general, isn't talking about the suffering of unfortunate circumstance. It's talking about a layer of psychological movement, psychological suffering, that essentially is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. Because of the way it is, because of the, let's say, painful circumstance. But the suffering isn't limited to when circumstance is painful. Even when circumstance is pleasurable, the nature of the suffering dynamic is that the suffering, the psychological overlay onto the life circumstance that we find ourselves, can exist even when there is pleasure in the moment. The thinking mind, which is the part of the mind that creates the suffering, is always worried about what will happen when this pleasure ends. What will I do then? I don't want this pleasure to end. I have to ensure it lasts forever. And so that thinking actually disturbs the enjoyment of the pleasure. It disturbs a peace of mind. And so what happens is we find that the different forms of suffering become all pervasive as a background to our life experience. So, once again, everything I've described hopefully can be understood as descriptions, not prescriptions of something for you to do or achieve. If we take them on as descriptions, as prescriptions, or if we take them on as descriptions and then say, okay, so that sounds like a good description, now I'm going to make it happen, then that movement could be a movement of the part of the human being that creates more suffering. So hopefully the concepts are heard as descriptions. They become part of our up-to-date conditioning. And to start seeing our life experience as described by the concepts is enough. The seeing in itself brings about automatic change, slowly sometimes, not necessarily change at the rate that our preferences would like. But actually that's the most efficient way that change happens, when there is a indifference in a way, an indifference to change happening. Not an indifference that prevents a curiosity, not an indifference that prevents seeing, but an indifference that says, actually, I leave change up to life. It's always been life that brings about change. And so attitudinally, we can start allowing life to look after the outcomes, and yet still be interested in observing our life experience and seeing it more clearly. So I spoke about the concepts going from the intellectual understanding and sinking in deeper and deeper. And I explained that that happens when what is described in the concept, which is just a description, a pointer, starts being seen. And I suggested that sometimes the brain is so interested in just receiving information that it doesn't go to that next step of actually seeing what is being described. It can think about what is described so intensely that it thinks that because it understands the conceptual description, it's seeing what is described. And so in a way I could be describing an apple on the table in the corner of the room, and if I describe it with a lot of detail, and the brain receives all of this detail and creates a picture based on all of the details, and it really thinks about this a lot, the brain can actually mistake and think that it is seeing what is being pointed at, which prevents it from really seeing, really knowing beyond the intellectual understanding what is being pointed at. It's just a strange way that we've been designed. So the conceptual framework tends to be quite generic in its content. So it will say, the forms of suffering are guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. This word blame is generic. Each person has very particular forms of blame that are more common to them. And not only are there particular forms of blame, so judgment is a form of blame, hatred is a form of blame, resentment is a form of blame, jealousy could be a form of blame, criticism could be a form of blame. And so not only are there these subsets of blame, but there are also very particular situations that make up the story of the various forms of blame for each person. There might be a blaming one's brother or sister for a particular event that happened. There can be a blaming one's brother and sister for a whole series of events with a standardized theme. They can be blaming girlfriend or boyfriend, ex-girlfriend or boyfriend for the way they functioned in the relationship, the behaviors that they did or didn't do. So those are very particular, energetic forms of the root of suffering, what we can call, and do call in the teaching, the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, and we'll explain that. They are very specific and non-generic forms of suffering in each person. So if we just remain with the generic explanation of blame, for example, and don't ever drop into our own experience and see the specific form of blame that is relevant for us, then essentially we're remaining on the intellectual level, believing that we are really understanding the conceptual framework, and yet we find a stagnation will happen. We'll find, why isn't my suffering or my seeing going deeper? Why isn't change happening? And often the reason is because there is some sort of block or barrier that is preventing the conceptual framework being seen based on your own personal experience, meaning seeing it as it presents for you. So I'm laboring this particular phenomena so that hopefully this new conditioning, and really all the talks are is just a set of new conditioning being delivered by life using this instrument. Life is always using each of us as instruments to bring about the story of life as it's designed to unfold. So these talks are life delivering new conditioning. And the new conditioning has the capacity, or does, change our up-to-date conditioning. Because up-to-date conditioning is the result of all of the new conditioning delivered moment after moment after moment after moment in life. So life doesn't ever stop delivering new conditioning. Even smelling a rose is new conditioning. Walking on the street and having to deal with traffic is new conditioning. The more you get to deal with the traffic, the better you are at negotiating the traffic, let's say. Because life has delivered new conditioning that has changed your up-to-date conditioning. And so you are continually changing. So if life delivers certain new conditioning, that can radically change your up-to-date conditioning. So these concepts are not the sort of concepts you hear generally in daily life. In fact, out in daily life, what society is confirming to us is you are the doer, the other is the doer. You are a separate independent entity in control of everything that happens through you, and you have to become better. And your happiness is to be found in outcomes. Your happiness is to be found in being a better human being. And so we've received that new conditioning. New doesn't mean never been heard before. New means new conditioning in each moment, which could be the same sort of conditioning that was delivered a week before and a week before that. So life has delivered new conditioning in each moment of a particular type. And that has become part of our up-to-date conditioning. And if life starts delivering a different sort of new conditioning, that too has the capacity and will change your up-to-date conditioning, and it can change it radically. It can dissolve a whole lot of beliefs about who we think we are, what we think we need. But in order for that dissolving to start happening at a deep level, attention needs to be brought onto the level of daily living, where the concepts start getting applied, where what is described gets seen, where what is described gets felt, because some things can't be seen. So what I'm talking about by the word seen means understood, not on an intellectual level, but because we come in direct contact with it. So if we can come into direct contact with the blame for someone, then we can know it, we see it. That might mean that we've blamed someone for years and never really realized that we're doing that, or at least didn't register the significance of what this blame is. And if attention comes on it and it's seen as blame, and blame is one of the forms of suffering, and remember, enlightenment is just the end of suffering. So enlightenment is the end of blame. if one day we see it and we say, this is a story that I've had towards my mother or father or friend or ex-employer, this is a story and it's blame, we can have it can be a real aha moment. This in practical terms, like for myself, based on my own experience, this is what the concepts are talking about. If we don't ever feel it, then we go around with this notion of blame, for example. And we haven't really understood it at a deep level. We understand it conceptually. Oh, blame is an attitude towards the other, towards what they have done that delivered pain to me. Right? So intellectually we can say, yeah, I understand what blame is. Blame is an attitude towards the other for something that they did that hurt me, where we see them as the doer, the one that was in control of what they did to hurt me, and where I say, you hurt me, I hate you. So that's the concept that's been delivered. It gets delivered to the working mind, it becomes part of the intellect, and someone can be very proficient at describing the concept. You can understand it intellectually, and yet this connection between the concept on an intellectual level and seeing those movements directly and seeing where the blame is and what form it takes when it arises for you. Seeing the guilt and shame where it arises for you. Seeing the pride, which is linked to personal doership, which is the basis of guilt and blame. Seeing it, seeing the pride arise. Seeing expectation, which is another form of the suffering, and really starting to see, oh look, I do this so many times in the day, and seeing it. Because the reality is that this movement that I'm talking about has become habitual and persistent, and so habitual that it's become the background of how we relate to life. It's actually become so much the background, and we're so involved in that thought process that we have no distance from it, which is why we don't see it, because it's become essentially who I am. When that attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome is in the system, it's the self-identity. It's become the self-identity, who I am, and it happens automatically. It's a commentary towards what is happening in life. And so we have no perspective on it. No way of seeing it. So as it's described, as blame, for example, is described conceptually, and then the concept becomes understood intellectually, and we understand that it's no good just going around with the intellectual concept, but we have to see that movement arising for ourselves. The seeing can sometimes be a great revelation, because that seeing means a shift of being the blame to seeing the blame. A really significant movement in the process. It's a shift, a perspective that if it doesn't happen, the process stagnates at that place. And that's the explanation as to someone saying, why isn't the suffering changing? Why isn't it ending? Why isn't it diminishing? You know, I've listened to so many satsangs. Why isn't changing? This is one of the first reasons to check and see, maybe that's why it isn't changing. Because we're not seeing that movement and observing it as a happening within our own system. So, just to round it off and to make it really clear what I'm saying, if I talk about a concept of the breaking of objects, so I can describe it conceptually. I can say that certain objects have certain structural makeups. And in life, what happens is if you apply a pressure to an object, if the pressure, if the force applied to the object is greater than the structural makeup of the object can withhold, the object will break. That's a concept of a very simplistic concept of some law of physics. What I've spoken about is objects, very generic. What I've spoken about is a force applied against the object, very generic. Now, what is relevant in your life is not to just refer to objects and undefined forces, but to see, for example, the fact that you will use the example of an egg. See, an egg is an object. So now we've taken the generic concept which we understand intellectually. I hope people understand the concept I've put forward intellectually. You have an object that has a specific structural makeup, and if a force that is greater than the structural makeup can withstand, then the object will break. Someone can say, I understand that conceptually, not a hard concept to understand. I understand it intellectually. We then need to change object into some specific object if we're going to see this in action for our own life. So then we see an egg, it's an object. And we see someone getting a knife and hitting the egg, and the egg cracks open, and then they break it into the pan to make a scrambled egg or fried egg. So we see an object with a certain structural makeup. We see the applying of a force to the object, and if the force is greater than the structural object can withhold, it will break. If someone got a toothpick and hit it, it wouldn't break the egg. Right? And so we then understand the concept beyond intellectual. We've seen it. We start to understand it based on our own experience. So you put a tick next to the concept. So I understand this not only intellectually, but for myself, based on my own observation, based on my own experience. And we might need to observe something many times and see it in action in relation to a glass that falls off a table and breaks. And we can see that at the point where the glass hits the ground, a force is being applied to the glass by the ground, thanks to the gravity that is pulling it down towards the ground. And if the glass breaks, we know that the force applied to the glass is greater than the structural formation of that object can withhold. So then we see it, or we understand it in form of an egg. We understand it in relation to glass, in relation to human bones that break. Now, the understanding has gone deeper and deeper and deeper. each time we see this for ourselves. So when we talk about blame, let's see the blame. And when blame happens, we don't see blame as a generic thing. We see blame towards a specific person for a specific action. We see it arising in a specific form. So blame is a very generic word. But so what we feel, what we can see happening is blame. But now we know blame as it arises in us. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. I started off saying that we were talking about happiness for the human being in daily living. I then threw in, enlightenment is the end of suffering. We're not talking about enlightenment. Why did I throw enlightenment in? We're talking about happiness for the human being in daily living. The concept was put forward that happiness for the human being turns out to be happiness not in the form of pleasure, 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 but rather happiness in the form of continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And continuous, unbroken peace of mind was described as the end of suffering. It is suffering that disturbs our self, our being, that is at peace until suffering arises. So happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. If enlightenment is the end of suffering, and if happiness for the human being is the end of suffering, then we could draw some conclusions. Enlightenment and happiness for the human being are the same thing. What is happiness for the human being? It's the end of suffering. What is suffering? Suffering is guilt, with its subsets under guilt: insecurity, lack of self-worth, generic guilt or embarrassment for not having performed a certain way, shame, some forms of depression, blame in its different forms, pride in its different forms, arrogance, sense of superiority, judgment, worry and anxiety about how life will turn out, and expectation about how we feel life needs to be in the future, and a functioning in this moment that is obsessed with life. We're trying to control life so it turns out a certain way. So these are all the forms of suffering. So happiness for the human being, or enlightenment, if we agree they are the same thing, means functioning in daily life as a human being, but no longer in a way where our attitude to what is happening in life is an attitude that generates these forms of suffering. And when we look at the suffering for ourselves, once we start seeing it arising and recognizing it in its different forms, we'll come to know for ourselves that suffering is not circumstantial. The suffering is not the circumstance itself. So this is what I'm describing here as part of the conceptual framework. Another concept. Suffering is not the circumstance itself, but our attitude to the circumstance, how we relate to what has happened in the circumstance. And the further description is, what is the attitude that we currently have that doesn't deliver happiness? What is the attitude that we currently have that turns into the presence of suffering? And when we look at it, or the description is that is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. What is the attitude that is there when suffering no longer arises? It's the absence of the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. What is the attitude of personal doership? The attitude of personal doership is a way of seeing the other and yourself as a separate, independent entity in complete control over everything that one thinks, in complete control over everything one feels, in complete control of everything one says, and in complete control of how one acts. That is a deeply ingrained belief that life has put in place. And it is what we call, in this teaching framework, the attitude of personal doership. And if that attitude of personal doership is in place, we're forced, there's no option, to see the actions of myself, especially when they deliver a painful outcome. My actions deliver a painful outcome to myself or someone that I love. I make a decision, and the decision turns out to lead to a financial loss, let's say. Or the decision I make ends up hurting someone I care about, or even a stranger. If I have this attitude of personal doership, it means I am seeing myself as a separate, independent entity that is the orchestrator, the controller of what happened. And so then I have to hate myself for having functioned in a way that has delivered pain to myself or someone I care about, or a stranger. Because my idea of myself is that I should have and I could have done a better job. And furthermore, the other part of this attitude that creates suffering is attachment to outcome, where we believe deeply that my completeness, which we don't think we have at the moment, because the feeling is of uncomfortableness and a sense of lack. Because of that, there is a deeply ingrained belief that says my completeness that I don't have at the moment will be found in the future in the form of pleasure, 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 in the form of things turning out a particular way, circumstantially. So financial success, love success, relationship success of all sorts of relationships, being loved by society. That's essentially our idea, our ingrained belief of where our completeness is going to be found. And so when we function in a way that delivers pain to myself or to society, we essentially say, look, there you are, you've sabotaged your completeness by functioning this way and delivering pain to the other. How are they going to love you if you deliver pain to them? And so our deeply ingrained belief is, I need society to love me because that's where my completion is to be found. I need my investment decisions to be perfect because my completion will be found in financial success. And if I have financial success, then society will love me even more. We'll say, what a clever investor he is. And that's often why, if there is financial success, then people want very big houses and very flash cars so that people can recognize their financial success. And the hope is that if people recognize my financials, they will appreciate me. All of this confirms or is part of the strategy of trying to get a happiness through outcomes, which is where we believe it's to be found. So going back to this combination of personal doership and attachment to outcomes, if that's in place and the way that I function delivers pain from time to time, that is seen as an attack on my happiness, an attack that has happened because of the way that I functioned, and I see myself as the doer, and so I hate myself. That's shame. And if the other functions a particular way and the other delivers pain to me or someone I care about, then that pain is seen as an attack on who I am, not my happiness. The other is seen as the doer, personal doer, which is the way I see myself. So I have to see the other the same way. And I hate them. For what they did, that is an attack on my happiness. So if that belief is in place, if that's part of the human's makeup, then we're forced to feel shame and blame, pride, expectation, worry and anxiety. These all make complete sense when there is a certain belief structure in place. So that's an explanation. If someone says, why do I blame? Why do I feel so much shame? Why am I always looking into the future and looking back into the past? The answer is very simple. Because there is a deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. That's the answer of why the suffering fills our life experience. So, is it true that we are the doers of everything that happens through us? Is it true that our happiness is to be found in outcomes? That I am incomplete at the moment? Is it true? And is it true that my completeness will come when society loves me or when I have become perfect? This is what we need to investigate. If it's true that we are the doers, meaning we are a separate independent entity in complete control of everything that we think, feel, say and do. If it's true that our completeness will come sometime in the future, that we're not complete now, then frankly it makes complete sense for those attitudes towards what is happening, which is primarily a result of how each individual is functioning, their actions and what they deliver, then it would make complete sense for the suffering to be there. It would actually be a bit of a delusion for us not to suffer, for guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation not to be there. If it's true that I am the one in control, the other is the one in control, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. The good news is that this freedom from suffering, this liberation, this happiness on a continuous unbroken basis is available to the human being. There have been many, proportionately not so many, but on a number basis, many humans throughout history that have been telling us about this based on their own experience, saying, I want you to know that this state, this way of living, is available for the human being. So the end of suffering is a potentiality for the human. This change has happened in many human beings throughout history. And there are numerous, really numerous texts and recordings that are describing what is important for us to know in order for this change to happen. And in brief, I could say that the good news is that the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which when we look at it, when we look at the suffering for ourselves, is the basis of the suffering. The good news is that's a misinterpretation of life. That's a misinterpretation of what the human being is. It's a misinterpretation of what the human being needs in order to be complete, which is really great news. It's an error. The basis of suffering, the basis on which suffering arises, is an error, a misunderstanding. Which is why it can end, because errors can be corrected, misunderstandings can be corrected. And when that happens, the error is no longer there, means the fruit of the error no longer arises. It's like chopping down a tree. If you chop down the mango tree, you can't get mangoes anymore. If you chop down the tree of suffering, if you uproot it, you can't get suffering anymore. The root of suffering is a misunderstanding of who we are. A misunderstanding that I am the doer of everything that happens through this human instrument, and that this human being that I am requires life to be a particular way in order to be complete. That's the misunderstanding. So that's why teachings have been telling us this process is a process of coming to know yourself, coming to remember what you really are, for the illusion to fall away. And what's the illusion? The illusion is a psychological illusion, a psychological error, a psychological belief that acts as a veil between our true self, or a realization of what I am, and my experience. A veil between what I truly am and our experience of life. When we put it this way, hopefully it can be seen quite simply. So there is a set of beliefs inside me, or not inside, part of my makeup, part of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Right? What the human being is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So really all that any human being is, on a biological and psychological level, is because of genes and up-to-date conditioning. So any misunderstanding is also a result, is a subset of genes and up-to-date conditioning. Life put in place the genes and up-to-date conditioning. We didn't choose which parents we were born to. We didn't choose which country we were born into, what the political view was, what the religious view was, what the culture value system is. We didn't choose which school we go to. We didn't choose which temple we were part of. And all of those factors, all of those variables determined the new conditioning that was delivered to us moment after moment after moment. We didn't choose how the sperm and the egg came together and then started to grow, which is the genetic part. And when we look at it, the genetic structure and the up-to-date conditioning are not really two. We create a conceptual distinction so we can come to understand it more clearly, but really the two coexist. The genetic structure has never been ever independent from the conditioning of life. So how we are in each moment is a result of life forming us this way. So ironically, the belief in personal doership that is very much in place in the human being, and part of the process is to see, to acknowledge, yes, I do have as part of my makeup the belief that I am a separate independent entity in control of everything that I say, for example. And the explanation that I'm just putting forward is that the human being is a result of only two factors. Genes and up-to-date conditioning. And life has put those in place and is continually adjusting those. So life has put in place the belief that we are the doer, whereas in fact, there never has been a psychological doer, or there never has been an actual doer. There's only been the belief in personal doership that life put in place. We've always been instruments through which life is functioning. We've always been biological robots. But biological robots that have been programmed by life to see themselves as something which they're not. So the biological robot has been programmed to not recognize that it's a biological robot, to not recognize that it's a biological and psychological robot. And the liberating factor is when life programs the biological robot to realize, I'm a biological robot. I always have been a biological robot. I've never been anything other than an instrument through which life is functioning. The realization that I'm a biological robot doesn't reduce the life experience down to anything less than it always has been, in terms of, for example, feeling emotions, feeling love, feeling empathy, compassion. Those are all outputs of this biological and psychological instrument. So acknowledging, saying, I am a biological instrument, if it's misunderstood, can sound like, that's pathetic, But that would only be because of our assumption of what it means to be a biological instrument. To be a biological and psychological instrument means to experience life to exactly as we've always experienced it, with all of its different depths and facets to it. Recognizing that we're a biological instrument means that the misunderstanding that was there before can fall away. And then the biological instrument no longer produces certain aspects that it produced before, such as guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. The great aspect of this is that even though we're a biological instrument, there is a consciousness functioning through this biological instrument. And there is a feeling of free will. There is a feeling that is part of the consciousness that I exist. There is the capacity to be self-aware. There is the capacity in the human being, because of the complexity of the intellect, to not only be, or what is self-awareness? Self-awareness means to be able to contemplate one's own existence. So animals are also an instrument, a biological instrument, designed by life, with a consciousness functioning through them. But an animal's, the instrument of animals doesn't include a complex enough intellect for the animal to contemplate their own existence. So the human being is the most developed form of biological instrument that we're aware of. And it does have the complexity of intellect to be able to contemplate its own existence. Now that is what Ramesh used to refer to as the dubious gift of the intellect. Why is it referred to by him as the dubious gift of the intellect? Because it's a double-edged sword. The complexity of the intellect in the human being that is complex enough to contemplate its own existence, when misdirected, turns into this story of, why is this happening to me? Why was I born like this? What's going to happen in the future? All of the different forms of suffering. Whereas an animal doesn't suffer in the way that a human suffers. Now, I know people will be watching and saying, animals suffer. I'm not saying animals don't experience pain. I'm not saying animals don't have emotions. I'm not saying animals don't have feelings, but they don't have an intellect that says, why is my owner so cruel to me? They have a feeling of pain if their owner hits them with a stick. They will develop a biological fear when they see the owner. But that biological fear doesn't turn into a psychological uncomfortableness with oneself. The animal doesn't say, oh, I get hit because I'm not really a good enough animal. It doesn't say, I hate my owner. I hope that one day he gets hit by a truck. That's the psychological suffering that a human being very much experiences because of the complexity of the intellect that can think in terms of time and can contemplate their own existence in terms of along a timeline. This complex intellect, however, when directed in the right way, is what allows us to appreciate our own existence. An animal doesn't have the capacity to be enlightened, although an animal doesn't have the capacity to suffer. Enlightenment is the end of suffering, but also a connection, a conscious connection to the core of who we are, a realization, a recognition of this core, which requires the complexity of the intellect, requires the complexity of awareness that an animal doesn't have.
Without the sense of I for the dog or for an animal, the pain then becomes theoretical, isn't it? Because there is no, isn't there required something to experience a psychological entity to experience even pain?
So I'm not saying the dog doesn't have a sense of existence. They don't have the capacity to become aware of their sense of existence, but the sense of existence, the I for a dog, is very much there. It's part of the consciousness that is functioning through the dog. So the dog knows that they are, let's say the dog has a sense of being a particular physical entity, and it will run after an animal that it wants to eat, let's say. And so it has a biological makeup and has a biological intelligence. And so in order for there to be pain, it doesn't require this psychological sense of me. So there's a distinction between the presence of a sense of I and the psychological me. So we might think that pain only exists if there is the me present. But pain exists when there is a biological structure with biological preferences. So if the psychological entity in the human being falls away, the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, the human being will still, if someone gets a knife and cuts them or puts their thumb in a vice, will still experience the physical pain of the body. It doesn't require us to judge pain as good or bad, or to even label it as pleasure or pain, in order for pain to be there biologically. So a dog will experience pain on a biological level. pain doesn't require us to judge it as pleasure or pain in order for it to be present as a sensation.
Would it be similar to like a really sophisticated computer program that's designed to behave or exhibit character as if it's experiencing pain? Because it doesn't have the self-awareness, assuming.
Yeah, but a dog has awareness, whereas a computer doesn't have awareness. So a computer could be designed, you can have a robot that is designed that if I hit the robot, because there will be mechanical sensors on the outside of the robot is programmed to say, ouch, and push me away, let's say, which will create the impression that the robot is experiencing pain, whereas in fact there is no awareness in the robot other than a programmed if-then, right? Which is not awareness itself, but a
Simulation of awareness.
A simulation of awareness. Whereas a dog has consciousness functioning through it. And so consciousness has two aspects, being and awareness. They're two faculties of consciousness. So the dog will register the punch in a much more complex way than the robot would. The dog will register the physical pain as a physical sensation, whereas the robot has no capacity, because it doesn't have consciousness functioning through it, can't register the physical pain. It can only behave as if, that's right. Because it will behave as if only if it's programmed to. So with a robot, there's no consciousness flowing through, so there is no sense of I. Whereas a dog has a sense of I. A human being has a sense of I, which is the very basic, one of the things we need to wake up to, is the fact that I am. And every human being has this experience intimately. It's there in every single moment. What the human hasn't, by and large, recognized is the presence of this sense of I, hasn't appreciated it, and yet it's there. So if I ask you to close your eyes, just to demonstrate this sense of I that is functioning in all of us. So if you want, you can close your eyes, and I'll ask a question. And answer the question not from your intellect, but answer it by becoming present with your experience right now. So one of the ways of becoming present with your experience right now is bring your attention to what you would refer to as the back of your eyelids when they're closed. And if you bring attention to the back of your eyelids, what you might realize is that if you're present with the experience as it's presenting right now, dropping any idea of there being a physical world, let's say, dropping the idea that you're sitting in a room and that there's someone else talking to you, and just bring attention to the back of the eyelids, realize that there is this vast open space, realize that there is sound in the form of a voice arising within this vast open space. The sound comes out of nothing and then subsides back into nothing. And you might notice that there can be a presence with the experience as it's presenting in that moment. And bringing the attention to the back of the eyelids means you are present with the experience much more so than if you don't bring attention there, because generally we will be caught up in a whole lot of thinking. So now I'll ask the question that you can answer, hopefully based on the direct experience in this moment. You don't need to think about it. See if the experience gives you the answer. And the question is, are you dead? And the experience tells us, if we register the experience and the subtle aspect of the experience, is no, I'm not dead. I am. I exist. It's the sense of I that is present for everyone in every moment of life. The presence of presence. The presence of the sense of I, or I am. And it's such a fundamental part of the human being, what we could call the core of the human being, that is there because we have a consciousness functioning through us. It's so fundamental to our experience that we've lost interest in it. It seems insignificant. We're much more interested in the pleasure that we don't have in this moment. Our thinking is all about getting something that we don't have, something we believe we don't have. Whereas this sense of I, the consciousness that is functioning through us, is the core of the human being. And a recognition of that, being that, a connection to that consciousness, is what grows and confirms to us that, I don't need anything more in this moment. It starts undermining the belief systems that say where my happiness is to be found is in the future, in the attainment of pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. We start to see that if I drop back into this sense of I am, I exist, and rest there, we can rest there prior to thought. We might find ourselves being able to drop out of the story of what I need into a place of this being and realize that there is this sense that something is missing or that there is a problem in life only because there is a thought that says something is missing, there is a problem in life. So if we find a movement that starts being able to drop out of that thinking process that says there is a problem, and we drop back into our being and remember that this is what I really am, then in the absence of that thinking, our experience is there is no problem. It becomes our direct experience. So that's not meant to be a concept that we just hold on to. Oh, what I am in this moment is complete. That's how it's described. But the description is there in order for us to know it, to be the sense that I am in this moment. Oh, and then realize that the thinking mind says, no, you're not yet. You need to become. When you become, then everything will be okay. And so as we remember, oh, I am, then this thinking mind that says, no, you're not yet, is seen to be the perpetrator of our peace of mind. And that the simple falling away of that perpetrator, of that disturbance, reveals the peace of mind that we always have been. This is why Nisargadatta's emphasis was on I am, because I am is the antidote. That it's always there, it's our home, we can return to it at any moment once this movement back to our being, which is part of the consciousness that is functioning through us, at any moment we can drop into this being and it corrects the story, which is the suffering, that says I am not. and it corrects it as a direct experience, a direct sense that is prior to any thinking, and we so realize, oh, this is the real. It's sometimes it could be referred to as the absolute, or all sorts of words to describe, to point, to get us to lose interest in what could be described as the illusion or the relative. It can be described as the truth, that this I-amness, which is the very base of every momentary experience, can be referred to in all these words. Essentially, those words are just there to help us differentiate between, let's say, the thought, I am this or that, and the actual sense of I amness, beingness. And each time we return there, if we've started to really see for ourselves that the thinking mind, all of the suffering, is a story about what I'm not, or what I don't have, what I need, what the other has done that has attacked who I am, what the other has done that has diminished my being, what I have done that diminished my being, what I need to do in order to add to my being. That's suffering is always a story about being diminished or being added to. We drop back into our beingness, that which actually is in this moment, and what it tells you experientially, as a feeling, as a direct knowing. It doesn't tell you you are it, right? That's what dropping into it is. And what it informs us directly is, I am. That becomes really the antidote. It becomes the sort of, we've let the cat out of the bag. Once we rest in our beingness, it's like people can tell me I'm not. My thinking mind can tell me I'm not. And it's all ridiculous in the face of the direct I amness. Right? So then your partner can tell you you're not. Your boss can tell you you're not. Your friends can tell you you're not. Your thinking mind can tell you you're not. And the more you rest in I am, the less doubt there can be in yourself. So then the whole world can tell you you're not, and you just see the whole world as completely deluded. You know? Because I am. It's not a concept that I am. It's not they're saying you're not, and then you rebut with, no, but I am. And they say, no, you're not. And you say, oh, I am because of this, this, and this. All of that, this is prior to any of that. This is just a dropping into beingness, into I amness, and realizing, oh, I had a story that I believed that I'm not. So this is self-realization. That is the self. The I am is an aspect of self. Awareness, which is another aspect of the self that we can become intimately familiar with in each moment. Awareness is that which registers what is happening in this moment. If I raise my hand, if I'm saying, if a word, sound is happening, it's registered by the awareness that is the awareness of the consciousness functioning through us. And once again, like the I amness, it's always there. We're more interested in what we don't have, what we need in order to be complete, because we've lost touch with I am. And we're not interested in the fact that we're able to register, be aware, that's what I mean by be aware of each moment. We're not interested in that awareness. Who cares that the awareness is I'm interested in what I don't have, because I think that will complete me. And the irony is we're being redirected to see what we are. And that can only happen if these other beliefs start being diminished, start being attacked, start being undermined, and we start seeing them as the culprit. And then we might come back to the recognition, I am, as a feeling, as a sense in the body, is usually the sense of I am, is when we drop into the body, and a movement from head to heart, you could call, the sense of consciousness drops into the heart, where we can sit and be and rest in my I amness. No need to think. In fact, all of the thinking about the future becomes sort of irrelevant, because I am. What do I need to worry about the future for? This is why the fear of death falls away, for a very simple reason. The psychological fear of death. I'm not at all saying if someone said, I'm going to chop you up, they've captured me, and they said they're going to chop me up. I'm not saying I'm indifferent to that, right? As far as the pain of that, I've got no interest in that. If life can deliver me a life without that experience, I'm very happy. No, I'm not very happy because of that, but don't misinterpret the fact that I'm saying I'll be perfectly okay with being chopped up. Along with ultimately connected to I am, and the fact is that our I amness, our beingness, the human being that knows that they are, isn't interested in whether they will be. So if someone says, what about when you die? And the answer is, who cares? I am. I am now. So the peace isn't or the ending of the psychological fear of death isn't because, I know that I am, and I know that this I am is eternal. Right? That can be part of the process that gives us in a way, it's a sedative, a placebo maybe, yes, to a lot of the suffering we have, because a lot of the suffering is about not being complete, so we might get told that don't worry, what you are is eternal, what you are will never die. It can be very, what a relief. So I don't really need to keep worrying. What you are can't be attacked. At some point, when that concept has done its job and the suffering has been uprooted, and so it's not only that concept, it's any number of spiritual concepts do their job. At some point, when we're resting in our being, in our I amness, we ask ourselves this question: let me check if what I am, that I know intimately, what I am directly, my being, let me check if it tells me that I am going to exist after death, which is what the spiritual teachings have told me. Right? Let me just check, just to make sure, because I'm running around with this belief, with this concept that what I am will never die. Don't get me wrong, I use it, I have used it in spiritual teachings when it's appropriate as a teaching concept. So there's not criticism about it being used in a teaching, but if we're going to run around with it, we better check that it's actual, because we don't want to just have a belief of Santa Claus. So we go to our being, that which we are. And we find that, oh, I am, yes, it tells me I am. It's undeniable. Hey, hang on a sec. It's not telling me about it will be. And if we open up to the fact that I don't know that I will be after death, once the suffering has been uprooted, we find I can acknowledge that what I know is I am directly. What I don't know is that I will be after death. And we might think, oh no, if I acknowledge that, all my suffering is going to come back. And yet magically it doesn't. So then our evidence is my suffering ends because I know I am. And then if we look at our own experience in that state, if we have access to that experience, and if we don't, then other people have access to it and they've described it, and the description can become part of our change towards that place. Then the description, or for ourselves, we go, oh, I'm at peace because I am, not because I will be. So the fear of death falls away because our being is not interested in whether it will be. The thinking mind, the me, is very interested in whether it will be. You know, it's erecting statues and buildings and trying to leave a legacy in order for, just in case it isn't after death, at least I can feel some confidence while living that I've done everything I can for my legacy to carry on. Our sense of I amness couldn't care less really about anything other than its present being. Which is why it's said to be self-confirming, self-affirming, self-fulfilling, causeless, that it's our nature to be and to be at peace. Sure.
Roger, yesterday you spoke for 15 minutes in the end of your talk, but you forgot and you switched off the microphone. And it was very important for me just because
It was on the recording or after the recording?
After the recording.
Yeah.
It was maybe the video was there, but there was no sound. It was like you ended the satsang, then for 10 minutes there was silence, was sitting like this, and then you started to talk again. It was a clear recommendation how to behave when in the middle of the night all the defense mechanisms are dropped away and I feel like defenseless, and all these feelings of guilt, shame and blame and everything are suddenly coming from subconscious, unconscious, and you gave 3 recommendations. First, to accept totally. Second, to inquire into them. And third is to just to express them.
To feel.
And yeah, I forgot in short, but it was given in details. And if you can repeat it, I would be very thankful.
Okay.
Thank you.
So first thing I would say is that it's not really an instruction of how to deal with the uncomfortableness that arises. but rather a description of one of the ways that can happen that is particularly useful as part of this process. Right? There are more than the three ways, because one of the ways which we're very familiar with is to resist, for example, the uncomfortableness, which is more uncomfortableness on top of the uncomfortableness. Now, if that happens, it's part of life, and so I'm not saying that that is invalid. Right? That's part of our development of our suffering, and at some point that then becomes part of the undoing. So the three ways that can happen are witnessing, inquiring into the different forms of suffering using the concepts, so being interested to see the suffering and understand whether it's shame, whether it's blame, whether it's anxiety, and so being interested in the suffering that's there, to be able to see, as I described at the beginning of this satsang, see particularly for oneself what form of suffering the feeling is taking. So one, witnessing, which is it's here, it's a happening, and I didn't create it. I don't have the capacity to get rid of it. I've been trying for my whole lifetime. If I had the capacity, I would have managed to get rid of it by now. So that is non-involvement in the suffering when it arises. And if that happens, so once again, this is not an instruction of which one to do, it's just a description of three different ways that are quite beneficial. If that happens, and there is an allowing it to be there, what can often happen is it will either just be there and there'll be a sense of spaciousness and it will be less intense than when you're resisting it, or it just dissolves. Right? But remember, this isn't a suggestion as a means for you to get rid of suffering, because often we ask, what did you say? Because we want to get rid of it, right? So be very careful if you're trying to hear this as a solution to your suffering, because that's not really what I'm putting forward. It's a description of an attitude that can happen towards the suffering. The second is the inquiry along the lines, so using the concepts as a guide so that you can become more intimate with it and understand it more out of a curiosity. So you say, what is this uncomfortableness? Is it anxiety? Is it blame? Is it shame? And so you might say, okay, it's anxiety, I can see that, or shame. And then you say, what is it shame about particularly? Because you want to go deeper and deeper in understanding it. And so yesterday you were very honest in the different, in what is at the bottom of the shame. You know, I'm not good enough, but more specifically, I'm not good enough because of this, I'm not good enough because of that. So that tells you a lot of what's in the system, whereas often we're not interested in, and we don't have the tools to become really familiar with what it's all about. You know, often we just know, it's just uncomfortable, and we haven't seen it any more detail than that. The third one, which often doesn't get talked about in non-duality, because it might seem like therapy, it might seem like entertaining the person, aspects of the person, and so often it's discouraged. But at a certain point, especially when the understanding on an intellectual level and the deepening of that has started to happen, an understanding of the non-doership, an understanding of the or an understanding of the doership, and an understanding of the attachment to outcomes, once that's happened, in order for the understanding to go deeper and deeper, or in fact, the understanding going deeper and deeper starts uprooting the misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is contained in these energetic loads that are contained in the body. And as part of the uprooting of the belief, very often there is an emotional release. Right? So we don't really need to talk about it sometimes because it will happen automatically as part of the process. Right? So you can leave it out in a way of the discussion, and at a certain point it will be appropriate and it will happen automatically. However, this is why it's worthwhile talking about it. It's worthwhile talking about it because often the first part of the non-dual process is about witnessing without being involved. Starting to see, just to see. And so that needs to be encouraged. Like, don't be too interested in the details. Just be interested in stepping back and being a witness. If that's what we've been exposed to, which is important, right? We might not be able to allow an expressing to happen because the movement might be of one of always going to a witnessing position. Because that's what we've been told is most important. And it is up to a point, so that needs to be developed. The capacity to just see the suffering as a happening, not you creating it, just a result of the seed that's in the body. And so at night, the suffering, not only at night, but in the case you brought up, it happens specifically at night. So one of the valid movements is the witnessing of it. If that's all we've been told is important, witnessing, then feeling the feeling, really allowing it to take us over where there is no witnessing perspective, might seem like it's a unuseful or even a detrimental happening. And so our makeup will get in the way, will stop us from feeling, from allowing the energy to fully express itself, to take over. Because we'll think, no, I have to keep going back to this witnessing state. And one of the benefits of the witnessing is that the energy, so in that moment, can dissipate. The feeling can dissipate. That's one of the benefits of witnessing. But one of the downsides of witnessing is we don't tend to feel things in a great amount of detail with a lot of definition. And at some point, these energies need to be expressed in full detail. One, so that they can be understood as what's actually there, and two, so the detail can be seen, and automatically, without us needing to do it, the understanding of non-doership and non-attachment transmutes it or atones it. Means it sees what was put in place a long time ago, because the understanding in the body was very different back then. And in it being expressed, it's given an opportunity to be expressed in a way that didn't happen in the past. In the past, we didn't have the capacity to express it, to see it in an impersonal way. And so that energy of hatred towards the other, attachment to the outcome being very different to the way it was, arose in a very uncomfortable way. We didn't have the capacity to undo that uncomfortableness. We didn't have the capacity to see it from an impersonal perspective. So the uncomfortableness got suppressed, pushed under the carpet, essentially, because it was so uncomfortable. So the biological found a way, and the psychological found a way of suppressing it. So under the carpet means in the system. part of getting it out of the system is this understanding of non-doership and non-attachment, going deeper and deeper, uprooting these energies so that they start coming up into the system and get fully experienced in a way that we haven't done before, because when that feeling comes up, it feels so uncomfortable. It tells us it's going to kill us. That's what the core of the feeling can tell us, is this will kill me. If I experience this, I'm going to die. It's a result of a very complex psychological structure of those feelings. The reality is that if you experience those feelings for 10 minutes, half an hour, they can't kill you. The feeling can't kill you. It will tell you that it's going to kill you. So if a part of us, a part of the working mind, has understood, it will tell me it's going to kill me, but it won't kill me. There's a capacity to experience that feeling more than before, when we were convinced on all layers it's going to kill me. When we're convinced on all layers it's going to kill me, we'll push it away. We'll turn in the other direction. When we start to realize this energy in the system is the root on which all of the suffering stems from. It's the doership that was put in, doership and attachment that was put in place in the past, and it's what's making me relate to people in the present moment as the doer, and it's what's forcing me to receive pain as an attack on who I am. And in order for that to stop happening in the present moment, this root, this energetic load that includes doership beliefs and attachment to outcome beliefs from the past, actually has to come out of the system. One of the ways that it comes out, or part of the way it comes out, is through us allowing that repressed energy that wasn't expressed to be expressed. Means crying, means shouting, means feeling intense shame and blame, all of that. And if the system and the working mind understands that that is actually beneficial for this process, if it understands it is a valid third way of us relating to suffering when it arises, then sometimes that's what will happen, is the feeling will be intense. We won't resist it, because that's another relationship to it, but it's not one that I'm mentioning. At times that's going to happen. It's inevitable. We're just going to feel resistance to it. At other times we will witness it. At other times we will use it as an opportunity to understand what the suffering is. At other times we will surrender to the force of this energy, acknowledge it's in my system, I'm not going to fight it anymore. I'm going to surrender to it, which means the shame, the blame, the expectation can come out in full force. And if the system has an understanding of non-doership and attachment to outcome, it will come out and be atoned, be released. Maybe not all in one go, maybe over months. But when this starts happening, especially with the understanding of non-doership, meaning that we can see the event that happened in the past. We see an event where a business partner completely took advantage of the trust that was in the relationship. And when that happened, there was a great sense of hatred or a great sense of shame for having put so much trust in the relationship. A romantic partner that fell in love with someone else and left you when they were your whole world. All of these events from the past can be seen in a new light, the light of non-doership and non-attachment, which understands, yes, that circumstance was painful. It was part of the flow of life, which is either pleasure or pain. It was painful, but that actually wasn't an attack on who I am. If I was in touch with my being, I would have been able to drop into the core of who I am and realize, even without my partner, even given my partner has now married my best friend, let's say, I am. I can even wish them well. Not an attitude that was available back then. Right? And so when these energies come out, what will come out is the opposite of the attitude of non-doership and the attitude of non-attachment. What will come out is all of the doership and attachment that was locked away back then. Something is in the system now, the understanding of, can allow that to come out. Understand that's old, stagnant energy of doership and attachment. It makes sense that the system is flushing that out. And it flushes it out because there is this conscious capacity now, not necessarily in that moment, but in the system, there's a capacity to see these events differently.
Yeah. Is it possible to say in this way that there's so much this suffering, let's say blame, shame, guilt, all this shit inside the system, that when a new understanding starts to come in, then there is no miracle. This shit to come out, it creates all these painful sensations in the body, in the mind, and in a way, I can say that it's a positive sign, that this bad, stagnant, stale energies, they are being released, coming out, and there is no other way. When they come out, they create this uncomfortable feeling.
Sure. Yeah.
It's true?
It is. We have, in a way, you have to relive the situation, because as the energy passes through, you'll feel the quality of that energy. As the understanding of non-doership goes deeper and deeper, that experience becomes much less and less personal, really like energy just coming through. It really is just a movement of energy through the system. And the sense of witnessing that energy come through can become very pronounced. So it can become much easier as the process develops. But at first it can be very unpleasant. But afterwards we start to see that the system is lightening up. So the fact that these energies are coming out means that the system is ready to deal with them, to handle them. And it's not the only way that the energies can come out. It can come out in many different forms. In dreams at night, it can come out through physical illnesses of a sort of purging. It can happen simply because the new understanding goes in and changes the beliefs. So part of it can happen without a cathartic, but the cathartic is part of it. And so you might find yourself attracted to, at the right time, a tantra workshop, because those sort of to body work that can help that process. And so I have faith in the system, in the process. It will deliver what's needed. So even the support mechanisms will get delivered when it's needed. You might find yourself doing physical yoga, stretching, that can be part of opening up the physical channels to allow these energies to start moving. So yeah, it's a good sign. It's in a sense, you can look at the Jesus story and see that the 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, where he had to sit with himself, essentially. Even his friends, the apostles, they fell asleep at times, and it was a process that he had to do himself. It's referred to as the dark night of the soul sometimes. Part and parcel of the territory.
Yeah, in my case, I can say that already it is painful at night, but not as much as it used to be before. In the daytime, really the body and has its own ways of protection, defense mechanism. But in the nighttime, I had sometimes the feeling that someone put just a bag on my head, and professional boxers started to hit me, and because I couldn't see anything, I couldn't protect myself, and it was really very, very painful. But now it's not that way. It's painful, but not. It means maybe positive sign that already a lot of these energies, they were just liberated from the system.
Exactly.
Probably like this. So, and every time when there is this kind of uncomfortable feeling or pain, I can see it like a positive sign that something is getting liberated. It's true, like this?
I would say that that's, it is a positive sign. This movement is a lightening of the load, especially if you start experiencing for yourself that there's more space. Even understanding that suffering, it's part and parcel of life. Life has included the color of suffering in the creation of life a lot. And this understanding of non-doership, meaning, it is an experience, and each moment is part of the destined experience of life. So when we suffer, it's destiny for the suffering to be there. If that understanding comes in, then the suffering is bound to be witnessed more than when that understanding wasn't there. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So, you've mentioned three ways of dealing with this suffering.
Not really dealing with it, no.
Not dealing.
Three ways that can happen in relation to the suffering. Because dealing with it, once again, seems like I'm offering a solution to fix this. It's,
okay.
Yeah.
So, in my experience, I feel there's no question of, my whole problem is that there is no distance from the suffering and from expressing it and letting it out at whoever's there right in front of me. No problems, ever. And I can't believe that they're actually supposed to be repressed and people have to find ways to remove them, because my only way of being has been to give it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way I'm fortunate, but the ones in front of me are normally escaping, which is their problem. But it's too painful. It's the whole life, to deal with the whole life as a situation where it's beyond me to hold back and witness, and it's just immediately expressing it.
Mm-hmm. So let's make a distinction, because it's important, between expressing and releasing. They are two different movements. When the doership is very strong in us, then we don't have the potential to actually suppress. What happens is we will express our hatred to the other, right? If that's happening because there is a strong belief in doership and attachment to outcome, and the understanding of non-doership and non-attachment isn't really in the system, then what's happening is we are forced to express our hatred towards the other. Now, express doesn't mean release. It means it's getting expressed, but what is happening when you're expressing it is you're saying, I hate you for what you've done to hurt me, right? And that's the only understanding in the system, right?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Or are you saying it?
Well, a bit of both.
Okay, so I'd like to say something.
Yeah, okay.
No, here I feel it's less doership, more like a very low capacity or very low tolerance to hold and stay with a feeling. It's just so overwhelming. So if it's tears, then they're coming out, like the face starts shaking and you start gulping, and then they're out. And now I can very easily control them and just create anger out of tears. So the tears are behind, but there's just anger. So but the thresholds of being able to keep it and just say, okay, I can be with this. Come on, I can just stay with this. No, it has to go right to the person at that moment. And it's not coming so much from doership. My feeling is it's coming because there's just no gap between the pain comes and there's a reaction.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm not saying, oh, I'm this doer and I want to give it to you. It's more like I'm incapable of holding back right now.
Yeah, but the belief in doership doesn't mean that you will have a like a separate thought, I'm the doer and I'm going to throw this at you. The belief in doership is in the system, and when someone delivers pain, the blame towards them comes out automatically. But so listen to this part, right? The doership or because we've also spoken about how biological reactions in the moment are different to blame. There can be a biological reaction if this is your tendency. So if this is your makeup, you might have a very low tolerance to certain things, and so have a biological makeup of anger in the moment, right? If the belief in doership is strong, you will have the biological reaction of anger and simultaneous to it a strong amount of blame. The most important part is to see that the anger, the biological reaction of anger, and the arising of blame, if that's there, right, is not your doing, right? Meaning that life has designed you, genes and up-to-date conditioning, to be biologically angry in a situation, and if there is suffering, if there's blame, to have the blame. Right? The blame extends horizontally in time. The biological reaction is just a reaction in the moment. And the attitude that is the attitude I'm talking about that eventually works its way right into the core is an attitude where you understand, yes, it's painful. Yes, the other gets hurt. Right? But life is a predetermined story, unfolding in each moment as it's destined to unfold. The amount of pleasure and pain you are destined to receive in life is part of that story. The amount of pleasure and pain that the other is destined to receive is part of their story. The other is often the instrument through which life delivers pain or pleasure to you. And you are also going to be used as an instrument through which life will deliver pleasure or pain to the other. If this attitude can start to sink in, then you will continue to get angry as destined. You will continue to blame as destined, and a part of you will see this all as a happening according to life and not get involved in it. There isn't a more healthy attitude than what I've just described. Now, but once again, that healthy attitude, whether it happens or not, whether there is the remembering that this is all life unfolding or not, also part of destiny. I'm describing it as a concept which is new conditioning, so there's no reason why it can't become part of your up-to-date conditioning, right? That's how life will bring about change. So you asked the question, an answer was given. We can't hope for more than that. So the change or no change has already happened. And next time that life delivers pain through the actions of the other, you will see what happens, and if there is an attitude that can, after the event, let go of the fact that it happened that way, meaning understand it was destined to happen that way. If a part of you does that, then you know that the answer has become part of your up-to-date conditioning. Remember, the other day I said that things like dynamic could be good, because that's another way that the process can work. Everyone is ready for different things at different times.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that also, because I've been holding it back. Dynamic, again, I think is cathartic, but I'm already cathartic my whole life. I don't think I need it.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a fair comment. So, but there's a whole lot of different methodologies. I'm putting forward the methodology, the teaching that this teaching is. Included in this teaching, there is the acknowledgement that different approaches are appropriate for different people. And so be open to a range of new conditioning that can be useful at changing your up-to-date conditioning. I have a lot of faith in the conceptual framework. If you find that it resonates, if you find that it starts having an effect where you can start to see life more clearly as described, where you start feeling that the suffering is changing, then you can say, well, this is appropriate. If a process, a methodology, a teaching, a therapy, whatever it is, doesn't deliver a beneficial effect, then allow life to, well, be open to something new.
This has definitely helped me, the satsang.
In that case, you have your answer that it's appropriate.
Yes, clearly. I was just referring to this particular subject we were talking about, which is
of cathartic.
As in why one needs to, one can't witness, why can one not witness the anger? Was actually my specific, why does one get into the emotion and the expression of it, this emotional overload? Why is it always around?
So did you notice that when I talked about the 3 different forms,
yes,
I had pointed out that often we don't acknowledge the 3rd one as being valid, because the teachings that came before needed to emphasize a witnessing. Because that movement of first coming to just witness these energies from a distance is very appropriate and valid. In fact, almost a precursor to the benefit of this process I described of release, of deep feeling. So it can you can interpret that as being the witnessing is, if it's not there, is something that we can keep in mind as being very relevant. This capacity to witness, which really means seeing something that is objective, seeing something that is an object as an object. Non-witnessing is where we are completely involved in psychological and biological movements. So the teaching is describing these biological and psychological movements as a happening, not your doing. Witness the happening as a happening through a body-mind organism. Witness the rage arising in a body-mind organism. Witness the shouting happening through a body-mind organism. Right? That, in your case, as you describe it, may be more appropriate than the suggestion to allow these energies to fully express themselves. Everything is a happening according to life. So this witness thoughts arising as a happening, thought objects arising, emotion objects arising. So that suggestion is something that first describes the thought objects as it's put a description on it, so it's turned it into an object. Right? And if we can start now relating to the thoughts and say, well, that's a thought arising as a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning, a thought arising as a result of the biological organism. So we've described it, it's been described as a biological organism. That in itself turns it into something that can be witnessed. The body is a biological organism. What is aware of that biological organism? What is aware of the biological organism thinking? What is aware of the biological organism speaking? Don't answer that intellectually, but be that which is aware of the body moving, of the body speaking. And awareness isn't thinking about the body speaking. The awareness is not saying, oh, the body is speaking. Awareness is that which is silent and interested, but not interested in changing. It's just interested in being aware, awaring what is arising.
Witnessing. Aware.
Witnessing happens. There is not a witnesser. So witnessing happens when we stop trying to do witnessing. If you try to do witnessing, unfortunately, it's the opposite of witnessing happening. So, with the understanding that life is a predetermined story, how do I live my life? That can be a valid question. The answer is simple. In each moment, do whatever you think or feel to do, right? In the circumstance that you find yourself in. That's a description, not a prescription. It sounds like I'm telling someone to do something. Actually, it's a description that in each moment you will automatically, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, function based on what you think or feel to do. So you don't have to worry about how do I live my life. In each moment, do whatever you think or feel to do. It's a description. It's saying in each moment you will do or in each moment you will function according to a feeling or a thought that arises. You didn't create the feeling or the thought. That happens in the moment, and it will lead to an action or a behavior. So the answer to how should I live my life is, let life live you. Life is always living you. You don't have to worry about this question, how should I live my life? And yet I'll give you the answer, which you can see as a description of how life lives you. In each moment you'll find yourself in a circumstance. In that circumstance, the body-mind organism, based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, will function automatically. It will get angry, it will blame, it doesn't matter. Allow it to do its thing, with the understanding, hopefully, that this is life unfolding as it's destined to unfold. So having done whatever you think or feel to do, sit back and see what the outcome is, knowing that what you did was what was destined, knowing that the outcome will be as it's destined. So then, no need to have regrets about the past, no need to have expectations in the future, no need to complain in the present moment. If that happens, that is a description of living happily, allowing the body to do what it does without regrets in the past, expectations in the future, or complaints in the present. Not an instruction for you to live that way. It's a description of how life can unfold. Which really means let life flow.
Thank you.
Mm.